My name is Sophia Brown, and if you ask me about my life, I'll tell you it's like walking through a dense forest in my hometown of Vermont, sometimes dark and uncertain, but always with rays of sunlight breaking through the canopy to guide my way. I'm 29 years old now, a registered nurse who spent the last 6 years working in pediatric wards, specializing in caring for children from low-income families. My days are filled with 12-hour shifts, comforting scared kids, and making sure their families understand treatment plans. I drive a modest Honda Civic, live in a small apartment downtown, and my biggest luxury is the coffee maker I bought last Christmas. But behind this simple exterior, I carry the profound love and wisdom my maternal grandparents gave me, the ones who saved me from a childhood filled with neglect and empty promises. If you've ever been betrayed by your own family, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe if you want to hear how a quiet nurse finally stood up to relatives who tried to steal her grandparents' $45 million legacy and won. Let me start from the beginning because everything that happened later makes sense only when you understand where I came from. I was born and raised in Burlington, Vermont, where the mountains touch the sky and the winters are long enough to teach you patience. My mother, Victoria Brown, was a marketing executive for a pharmaceutical company, always chasing the next big promotion, the next corporate ladder to climb. She wore expensive suits, carried designer handbags, and spoke in business jargon even at the dinner table. My father, Richard Brown, was an investment banker who worked on Wall Street but lived in Vermont for tax purposes, as he always explained to anyone who'd listen. They met at a charity gala, the kind where people donate money to feel good about themselves while sipping champagne that costs more than most people's monthly rent. My sister Emma, she's 4 years older than me, and I were born as accessories to their perfect life plan. The successful power couple with 2 daughters in private school, family photos in matching outfits, Christmas cards that screamed, "We have it all together." But the reality behind closed doors was very different. I remember countless evenings sitting at our large mahogany dining table, just Emma and me, while our meals grew cold waiting for parents who were closing a deal or in an important meeting. When they did come home, they were either too tired to talk or too busy planning their next business trip. Mom would rush in, still on her phone, multitasking even during what she called family time. "Sorry, girls, Mommy's building your future," she'd say, kissing the air near our cheeks before disappearing into her home office. Dad was worse. He'd come home with his tie loosened, smelling of expensive cologne and other people's cigarettes, muttering about market volatility and portfolio diversification. He'd pat our heads like we were pets and vanish behind his Wall Street Journal. They weren't neglectful because they were poor, they were neglectful because they were obsessed with becoming richer. Emma, being the older one, learned quickly to crave their attention by excelling in everything. She became the perfect daughter, straight A's, violin lessons, debate team captain, early admission to Harvard. She learned to speak their language of achievement and success. As for me, I was quieter, preferring to read books about faraway places or help our housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, tend to her small herb garden in our backyard. I craved warmth, genuine connection, something my parents seemed incapable of providing. Fortunately, I found that warmth with my maternal grandparents, Harold and Eleanor Mitchell. They were like finding a cozy fireplace in a blizzard, exactly what I needed when I needed it most. Grandpa Harold was a retired teacher who had spent 40 years educating high school students in rural Vermont. He was a tall, lean man with silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. Grandma Eleanor was a retired librarian with gentle hands and a voice that could make any story come alive. Together, they had built something extraordinary from nothing, Mitchell Educational Services, a company that started as a small tutoring business and grew into a network of learning centers across New England, helping struggling students find their academic footing. The first time I truly bonded with my grandparents, I was 7 years old. It was during one of Vermont's harsh winters, and our house felt particularly cold despite the expensive heating system. Mom and Dad were having another one of their strategy sessions, which was their euphemism for screaming matches about money. Dad wanted to invest their savings in some risky hedge fund. Mom was worried about liquidity and market timing. They shouted technical terms at each other while Emma locked herself in her room to practice violin, and I sat curled up on the stairs, listening to the anger echo through our supposedly perfect home. I couldn't take it anymore. I put on my winter coat and boots and walked the half-mile through the snow to my grandparents' modest house on Maple Street. When I arrived, my cheeks red from the cold and my eyes puffy from crying, Grandma Eleanor was in the kitchen making hot chocolate from scratch. Not the instant kind we had at home, but real chocolate melted with cream and just a hint of vanilla. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, wrapping me in a warm hug that smelled like cinnamon and old books. "What brings you here on such a cold day?" I told her about the fighting, about feeling invisible, about wanting parents who actually wanted to spend time with me. Grandpa Harold sat down beside me at their small kitchen table and said something I've never forgotten. "Sophia, honey, love isn't about the size of your house or the price of your clothes. It's about the time you spend together and the memories you make." From that day forward, I spent most of my free time at their house. My parents didn't object. They were probably relieved to have one less responsibility to juggle. Emma sometimes joined me, but she found my grandparents boring because they didn't talk about achievements or competition. They talked about books, about helping others, about the satisfaction that comes from seeing a struggling student finally understand a difficult concept. Grandpa Harold taught me about education and patience. He showed me his old lesson plans, explained how he helped kids who everyone else had given up on. "Every child has potential, Sophia," he would say, his voice warm but serious. "Sometimes you just have to find the right way to unlock it." Grandma Eleanor taught me about empathy and community service. She volunteered at the local shelter, organized book drives for underprivileged schools, and always seemed to know exactly what to say to make someone feel better. Their house became my sanctuary. It was small compared to ours: 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen where the cabinets didn't close quite right. But it was filled with love, laughter, and the kind of conversations that actually mattered. They asked about my day not because they had to, but because they genuinely cared about my answer. They helped with my homework not to ensure I got perfect grades, but to make sure I understood the material. They tucked me in at night with stories and made me feel like the most important person in the world. As I grew older, the contrast between my two families became even more apparent. My parents' world was all about appearances and acquisitions. They bought a bigger house, newer cars, sent Emma and me to the most expensive private school in the state. But they were drowning in debt, constantly borrowing money to maintain their lifestyle. I overheard tense phone calls with creditors, watched my mother's fake smile crack when she thought no one was looking, saw my father's hands shake as he reviewed their financial statements. During my sophomore year of high school, their house of cards began to collapse. Dad's investment firm was investigated for fraud. Not that he was directly involved, but several of his colleagues were arrested, and the company's reputation was destroyed. Mom's pharmaceutical company downsized, and despite her years of loyal service, she was laid off. Suddenly, the people who had always lectured Emma and me about the importance of financial success were facing bankruptcy. They turned to my grandparents for help, of course. I remember the uncomfortable family meetings in Grandpa Harold and Grandma Eleanor's living room, where my parents would sit with their heads bowed, asking for loans to pay the mortgage, to keep Emma in her prestigious college, to maintain some semblance of their former lifestyle. My grandparents helped, but not without conditions. They required detailed financial records, proof of how the money would be spent, and regular check-ins about repayment plans. "Richard, Victoria," Grandpa Harold said during one particularly tense conversation, "you need to understand that money is a tool, not a goal. It should serve your values, not replace them." My father's response was predictable. "You just don't understand the modern economy, Harold. This is how business works now." Emma, who was home from Harvard for winter break, sided with our parents. She had become accustomed to their lifestyle of privilege and was horrified at the prospect of having to live modestly. "Why can't you just give us what we need?" she asked our grandparents. "You have all this money from your company." But I understood what my grandparents were trying to teach us. I had seen how their company operated, not as a profit machine, but as a genuine service to the community. They employed over 200 people, provided scholarships to deserving students, and consistently reinvested their earnings into better programs and facilities. Their wealth was a byproduct of their service, not the other way around. I also became aware of my Uncle James, my mother's younger brother, who lived in California and worked in the tech industry. He visited rarely, but when he did, he would spend most of his time asking pointed questions about the business, about my grandparents' estate planning, about the value of their assets. Uncle James was smooth and charming, but there was something calculating in his eyes that made me uncomfortable. The family's longtime assistant, Mrs. Rebecca Stone, a dignified woman in her 50s who had worked for my grandparents for over 15 years, would sometimes pull me aside during family gatherings. "Your Uncle James asks a lot of questions about the safe and the important documents, dear," she would whisper. "But your grandparents are very careful people. They see everything." As I finished high school and started my nursing program at the University of Vermont, I grew even closer to my grandparents. While my parents pressured Emma to pursue law or business, something practical and profitable, they barely paid attention to my career choice. "Nursing is fine," my mother said dismissively, "but you'll never make real money doing that." My grandparents, however, were incredibly proud. "Sophia, you're choosing a profession where you can make a real difference in people's lives," Grandma Eleanor said, her eyes shining with pride. "That's worth more than any salary." During my nursing studies, I would often stop by their house to share what I was learning, to ask for advice about difficult cases, to simply enjoy their company. Grandpa Harold was fascinated by the medical aspects of my education, while Grandma Eleanor loved hearing about the patients I worked with during my clinical rotations. They understood that I had chosen nursing not because I couldn't do anything else, but because I wanted to help people heal both physically and emotionally. After I graduated and started working at Vermont Children's Hospital, my grandparents were my biggest supporters. They attended my pinning ceremony when my parents were too busy with their latest business venture. They celebrated every small victory, when I successfully comforted a frightened child, when I helped a family navigate a difficult diagnosis, when I was recognized by my supervisors for going above and beyond in my patient care. Meanwhile, my parents' financial situation continued to deteriorate. They had borrowed extensively from my grandparents over the years, always promising to repay but consistently falling short. Emma, now a lawyer working for a prestigious Boston firm, had become even more materialistic. She drove a BMW, lived in an expensive downtown apartment, and constantly complained about her student loans. During family dinners, she would make snide comments about my simple lifestyle and openly speculate about our grandparents' eventual inheritance. "I mean, someone needs to manage their assets properly when the time comes," she would say, glancing meaningfully at our parents. "We can't let all that money just sit around collecting dust." But my grandparents weren't sitting around collecting dust, they were busier than ever. At ages 78 and 76 respectively, they were still actively involved in their business, still volunteering in the community, still finding new ways to help others. They had recently announced plans to establish a scholarship fund for first-generation college students and were working on expanding their tutoring services to underserved rural communities. "We're not done yet, Sophia," Grandpa Harold would say with a twinkle in his eye. "There's still so much good we can do." Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning in early spring, and I was just finishing a particularly difficult night shift in the pediatric ICU when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my mother's number, but her voice was different, shaky, panicked, stripped of its usual corporate confidence. "Sophia," she said, and I could hear her struggling to breathe properly. "There's been an accident. Your grandparents, they were in a car crash. They didn't make it." The world seemed to tilt sideways. I was standing in the hospital hallway, surrounded by the familiar sounds of medical equipment and hushed conversations, but everything felt surreal. My grandparents, the two most careful, responsible people I knew, gone in an instant. They had been driving to a meeting with potential investors for their scholarship fund when a drunk driver ran a red light and struck their car head-on. I drove to the accident site first, needing to see it for myself. The intersection looked so ordinary, so innocent, just another corner where two roads met. But for me, it was the place where my world split into before and after. I stood there for nearly an hour, crying and trying to process that I would never again walk into their warm kitchen, never again hear Grandpa Harold's patient explanations or Grandma Eleanor's gentle laughter. The funeral was held at the Methodist church where my grandparents had been members for over 50 years. The sanctuary was packed with people whose lives they had touched, former students, business colleagues, community volunteers, grateful parents whose children had been helped by their tutoring centers. Person after person stood up to share stories about Harold and Eleanor Mitchell, how they had provided free tutoring to struggling families, how they had quietly paid for medical bills when someone couldn't afford treatment, how they had always been the first to volunteer when the community needed help. But even during the funeral, I noticed the way my family members were behaving. My parents sat in the front row looking appropriately somber, but I caught them whispering to each other about settling the estate and making sure everything is handled properly. Emma kept checking her phone, even during the service. Uncle James had flown in from California and spent most of his time asking Mrs. Stone pointed questions about my grandparents' financial records and the location of important documents. The day after the funeral, we were all summoned to the offices of Whitman, Hayes and Associates, the law firm that had handled my grandparents' legal affairs for decades. The office was in a beautiful old building in downtown Burlington, with tall windows that let in streams of Vermont sunlight and walls lined with leather-bound law books. Attorney David Whitman, a distinguished man in his 60s who had been my grandparents' close friend as well as their lawyer, greeted us with the appropriate gravity. We gathered in the main conference room, me, my parents, Emma, Uncle James, and Mrs. Stone, who had been specifically requested to attend as a witness. The mahogany table was polished to a mirror shine, and I could see my reflection in its surface as I tried to calm my racing heart. I wasn't thinking about inheritance. I had never expected anything significant. I was just hoping that my grandparents' final wishes would be respected and that their life's work would continue in some form. Attorney Whitman opened a sealed envelope with careful precision. His voice was calm and professional as he began to read, but his words hit the room like a thunderbolt. I, Harold Mitchell, and I, Eleanor Mitchell, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath our entire estate, including all cash assets, real property, business holdings, and investments, currently valued at approximately $45 million, to our beloved granddaughter, Sophia Brown. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Then chaos erupted. My mother shot to her feet, her face flushed with rage. That's impossible. Sophia, what did you do? How did you manipulate them? My father was sputtering, unable to form coherent words. This is fraud. We'll contest it. We'll have it overturned. Emma's reaction was the most vicious. You scheming little bitch, she hissed, her lawyer training apparently abandoning her in favor of raw fury. You pretended to be the sweet little nurse while you were really working them for their money. Uncle James was more calculated, his tech executive mind already spinning strategies. This will be tied up in court for years, Sophia. You'll spend more on legal fees than you'll ever see. Sign it over to the family and we'll manage it properly. I sat frozen, unable to process what was happening. I had never asked for this, never even dreamed of it. I loved my grandparents for who they were, not for what they had. But Attorney Whitman raised his hand for silence. There's more, he said calmly. Harold and Eleanor recorded a video message explaining their decision. He pressed a button on a remote control, and suddenly my grandparents appeared on a large screen mounted on the wall. They were sitting in their familiar living room, Grandpa Harold in his favorite recliner and Grandma Eleanor on the sofa beside him. Seeing them again, so alive and vibrant, brought fresh tears to my eyes. If you're watching this, Grandpa Harold began, his voice warm but serious, it means Eleanor and I have passed on. We want you all to know that this decision was made after years of careful consideration and observation." Grandma Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her gentle eyes looking directly into the camera. "We love all of you, but we've watched how each of you approaches money, responsibility, and family obligations. Only Sophia has consistently demonstrated the values we try to instill: compassion, integrity, and genuine care for others." Grandpa Harold continued, "Richard and Victoria, you've borrowed over $300,000 from us over the years, always promising to repay, but treating our help as an entitlement rather than a gift. Emma, you've made it clear that you view our estate as your future security rather than our life's work. James, your visits have been motivated by financial curiosity rather than family affection. But Sophia," Grandma Eleanor said, her voice softening, "you chose a career in service to others. You've never asked us for money, never treated us as a bank account with legs. You loved us for who we were, not what we had. That's why we trust you to use this inheritance responsibly to continue the work we started." The video ended, but the room remained in chaos. My family members were shouting over each other, threatening lawsuits, demanding I sign papers transferring portions of the inheritance to them. But all I could think about was the trust my grandparents had placed in me and the responsibility that came with it. "I need time to think," I said quietly, but my voice was drowned out by the arguments. Attorney Whitman stood up, his professional demeanor commanding attention. "The will is ironclad," he announced. "It was prepared with multiple safeguards specifically to prevent contestation. Harold and Eleanor underwent extensive psychological evaluations to prove their mental competency, and every aspect of this inheritance was documented and witnessed." As I left the law office that day, my phone was already buzzing with angry texts and voicemails from family members. Emma had posted something on social media about family betrayal and stolen inheritance. Uncle James was researching lawyers who specialized in will contestation. My parents were alternating between tears and threats. But I drove straight to the cemetery where my grandparents were buried, needing to feel close to them in this overwhelming moment. Standing beside their fresh graves, I made a promise: "I won't let you down. I'll use this gift the way you would have wanted." The battle for their legacy was just beginning, and I wasn't sure I was strong enough to fight it. But I knew I had to try, not for the money, but for the values they had taught me and the trust they had placed in my hands. Over the next few days, the pressure intensified dramatically. My parents showed up at my apartment unannounced, alternating between emotional manipulation and outright threats. My mother would cry and talk about how they were facing foreclosure, how Emma needed help with her student loans, how I was destroying the family by being selfish. My father would pace around my small living room, his face red with anger, shouting about how I had stolen what rightfully belonged to the whole family. "You were nobody before they died," he said during one particularly vicious confrontation. "Just a little nurse making $50,000 a year. Now you think you're better than us." Emma was even worse. She used her legal training to draft threatening letters, claiming she could prove undue influence and mental incompetence. She created a social media campaign painting me as a manipulative gold digger who had preyed on elderly relatives. Her posts went viral in our local community, and I started receiving hostile messages from strangers who believed her version of events. Uncle James took a different approach. He flew back from California with a team of lawyers and accountants, armed with complex legal documents and financial projections. He cornered me at the hospital where I worked, showing up during my lunch break with charts and graphs designed to prove that I was too inexperienced to manage such a large inheritance. "Look, Sophia," he said in his smooth tech executive voice, "I'm not saying you don't deserve something. But $45 million? You're a nurse. You don't understand investments, tax implications, wealth management. Let the adults handle this and we'll make sure you're taken care of." But I remembered what my grandparents had always taught me about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. I called Attorney Whitman and asked him to arrange a meeting with the entire family, not to negotiate or compromise, but to establish clear boundaries and consequences. The meeting was held at my grandparents' house, which was now legally mine but still felt like theirs. I had spent the previous evening there with Mrs. Stone, going through their personal belongings and discovering even more evidence of their careful planning. Hidden in Grandpa Harold's desk were detailed financial records showing every loan they had made to family members, every broken promise of repayment, every instance where their generosity had been taken for granted. When everyone arrived, I was ready. I had spent hours preparing, reviewing documents with Attorney Whitman, and steel myself for what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of my life. "I want to share some things you might not know about Harold and Eleanor Mitchell," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. I opened a laptop connected to the room's television and began displaying financial records. "Over the past 15 years, you borrowed a total of $847,000, I said, looking directly at my parents. "You promised to repay it with interest, but you've returned exactly $23,000. The rest you treated as gifts, even though the loan documents clearly specified repayment terms." My father started to interrupt, but I continued. "Emma, you borrowed $150,000 for law school and living expenses. You've repaid 8,000美元. Last year, you asked for another $50,000 for your apartment deposit, promising to pay it back within 6 months. That was 14 months ago." Emma's face was flushed with anger, but she couldn't deny the numbers displayed on the screen. "Uncle James, you borrowed $75,000 to invest in a startup that failed. When Grandpa asked about repayment, you said the money was gone and acted like it was his fault for making a risky loan." I pulled out a stack of printed emails. "These are messages you sent to Mrs. Stone over the years, asking about Grandpa and Grandma's assets, their business valuations, their estate plans. You visited twice in 5 years, and both times you spent more energy investigating their finances than actually spending time with them." The room was silent except for the sound of pages turning as Attorney Whitman distributed copies of every document, every loan agreement, every broken promise. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued, my nurse training helping me remain calm under pressure. "I'm establishing the Harold and Eleanor Mitchell Foundation, dedicated to continuing their work in education and community service. The foundation will provide scholarships, fund tutoring programs, and support families facing medical crises." I looked at each family member in turn. "Anyone who wants to be part of this legacy is welcome to apply for grants through the proper channels. But the days of treating this family's resources as your personal bank account are over." My mother started crying. "Sophia, honey, you can't mean this. We're family. Family members don't threaten each other, don't spread lies on social media, and don't hire lawyers to steal from each other," I replied. "You've shown me exactly what kind of family you think we are." Emma stood up abruptly, knocking over her chair. "This isn't over, Sophia. I have resources, I have connections, and I'm going to destroy you." Uncle James was more measured, but his threat was just as clear. "You're making a mistake. We can drag this out for years, cost you millions in legal fees. Why not just be reasonable?" I had prepared for this moment. Because being reasonable with unreasonable people is how we got here in the first place. After they left, I sat alone in my grandparents' house, feeling the weight of the responsibility they had given me. Mrs. Stone joined me in the kitchen, making tea the way Grandma Eleanor used to. "They're really angry," she said gently. "I know. But anger doesn't make them right." Over the following weeks, my family's attacks escalated. Emma filed legal challenges claiming undue influence and mental incompetence. She hired a private investigator to dig into my personal life, looking for anything that could be used against me. Uncle James launched a social media campaign claiming I had isolated my grandparents from their family and manipulated them into changing their will. The local newspapers picked up the story, painting it as a classic inheritance dispute with a twist, the sweet young nurse versus the greedy family. Some articles were sympathetic to me, others suggested I must have done something underhanded to receive such a large inheritance. But Attorney Whitman had prepared for this. He released the psychological evaluations proving my grandparents' mental competence, the detailed financial records showing years of family exploitation, and character references from dozens of people who had known Harold and Eleanor Mitchell personally. The tide of public opinion began to shift when Mrs. Stone gave an interview to the Burlington Free Press, detailing years of observing my family's behavior toward my grandparents. She spoke about overheard conversations where my parents discussed my grandparents' assets as if they already belonged to them, about Emma's casual remarks regarding her inheritance, about Uncle James's inappropriate questions about financial documents and estate planning. More importantly, former students and community members began speaking out about the Mitchell family legacy. Teachers shared stories about how my grandparents had quietly funded classroom supplies and field trips. Parents talked about free tutoring services provided to their struggling children. Business owners described loans and mentorship that had helped them get started. "This isn't about money," one retired teacher said during a public forum. Harold and Eleanor spent their whole lives investing in other people's success. If they chose Sophia to continue that work, it's because they saw something in her that reminded them of themselves. The legal challenges began to crumble when Attorney Whitman presented evidence of my family's financial exploitation. Court documents revealed the extent of unpaid loans, broken promises, and entitled behavior that had influenced my grandparents' decision. Emma's claims of undue influence were contradicted by medical records showing my grandparents' excellent mental health, and by testimony from numerous witnesses who could verify their independent decision-making. During this tumultuous period, I discovered more about the careful planning my grandparents had undertaken to protect their legacy. Mrs. Stone revealed that they had begun documenting troubling family behavior years before their deaths, keeping detailed records of every interaction, every loan request, every broken promise. They had installed discreet security cameras throughout their home, capturing conversations that revealed the true motivations of family visits. "Your grandparents were heartbroken by what they saw," Mrs. Stone confided during one of our evening conversations in their kitchen. "Eleanor would cry after your parents left, not because they had asked for money, but because they never asked about her arthritis or Harold's blood pressure. James would call from California, but only when he needed something. Emma visited during law school, but spent most of her time complaining about her classmates' wealthy parents and hinting about her own future inheritance." I watched some of these recordings and they were devastating. There was footage of my father rifling through Grandpa Harold's desk while he was in the bathroom during a family dinner. There were audio recordings of my mother and Emma discussing how much money they thought my grandparents had and what they planned to do with their share. There was a particularly painful video of Uncle James pretending to be interested in family photos, while actually photographing financial documents he glimpsed on my grandfather's desk. But the most revealing evidence came from their business associates and longtime friends. Attorney Whitman had collected dozens of witness statements detailing conversations where my family members had spoken about my grandparents' assets as if they already belonged to them. A former student of Grandpa Harold's, now a successful businessman, testified about overhearing Emma at a community event describing the tutoring centers as part of her inheritance. The pastor at their church recounted a conversation where my father had asked detailed questions about the tax implications of inheriting a business, months before my grandparents' accident. The psychological evaluations my grandparents had undergone were particularly thorough. They had visited 3 different specialists over a period of 2 years, each time testing their memory, decision-making capacity, and mental acuity. The results were unambiguous. Harold and Eleanor Mitchell were not only mentally competent but scored in the superior range for their age group in all cognitive areas. The doctors had specifically tested for signs of undue influence or coercion, finding none. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, one of the examining psychologists, provided compelling testimony during the legal proceedings. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell came to me specifically because they were concerned about potential challenges to their estate planning," she explained. "They wanted to ensure that their mental competency was thoroughly documented. In my 30 years of practice, I have rarely encountered individuals with such clear thinking and well-reasoned decision-making processes." The legal battle intensified when Emma hired a private investigator to dig into my personal life, searching for anything that could support claims of manipulation or undue influence. The investigation backfired spectacularly when the detective's report actually strengthened my case. It documented years of selfless behavior, my volunteer work at local shelters, my consistent visits to elderly patients during my off hours, my modest lifestyle despite having opportunities to earn more in private practice nursing. More damaging to Emma's case, the investigator uncovered her own financial improprieties. He discovered that she had been billing clients for hours not worked, had accepted expensive gifts from grateful clients in violation of legal ethics, and had been dating a wealthy older man primarily for his financial support. When this information became public through court filings, Emma's reputation in the legal community suffered irreparable damage. Uncle James's attempts to discredit me from California also backfired. His social media campaign attracted the attention of investigative reporters who discovered that his tech startup was actually a shell company designed to avoid taxes, that he had defaulted on multiple loans, and that he was under investigation by the IRS for unreported income. His credibility as a responsible heir evaporated when his own financial misconduct became public knowledge. The most powerful testimony came from unexpected sources, the hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by my grandparents' generosity and my own nursing practice. Former students traveled from across New England to testify about how Harold and Eleanor Mitchell had changed their lives through educational support and mentorship. Parents spoke about children who had been saved by my nursing care, describing late-night phone calls I had made to check on worried families and extra shifts I had volunteered to cover when colleagues needed time off. Mrs. Jennifer Martinez, whose diabetic daughter I had cared for during a particularly difficult hospitalization, provided especially moving testimony. "Sophia Brown didn't just treat my daughter's medical condition," she said, tears streaming down her face. "She held my hand during the scariest night of my life, explained every procedure in terms I could understand, and called me at home for weeks afterward to check on our family's adjustment to the new treatment regimen. She has the same giving heart as her grandparents." The contrast between my behavior and my family's became even more stark when witnesses described interactions they had observed over the years. Multiple people testified about seeing me help my grandparents with household chores, yard work, and errands, never asking for payment or recognition. They described me listening patiently to Grandpa Harold's repeated stories and helping Grandma Eleanor organize her volunteer activities. In sharp contrast, witnesses described my parents' visits as brief and focused on their own needs. They testified about seeing Emma ignore her grandparents while talking loudly on her phone about legal cases. They recounted Uncle James's visits where he spent more time asking about business valuations than engaging in family conversation. As the legal proceedings continued, I struggled with the emotional toll of having my private life dissected in public. Reporters followed me to work, asking intrusive questions about my family relationships and inheritance plans. Co-workers at the hospital were initially sympathetic but grew weary of the constant media attention. I worried that the controversy would affect my ability to provide quality patient care, the thing that mattered most to me professionally. But support came from unexpected places. Dr. Rebecca Thompson, the chief of pediatrics at Vermont Children's Hospital, issued a public statement defending my character and professional integrity. "Sophia Brown is one of the most dedicated and compassionate nurses I have ever worked with," she declared. "Her patients and their families trust her completely, and her colleagues respect her deeply. Any suggestion that she is capable of manipulation or deception is not only false but offensive to everyone who knows her true character." The Vermont Nurses Association also rallied to my defense, issuing statements about my volunteer work and professional excellence. They highlighted my participation in medical missions to underserved communities, my mentorship of nursing students, and my advocacy for improved pediatric care protocols. Even former patients began speaking out. The parents of children I had cared for during my 5 years as a pediatric nurse organized their own press conference, sharing stories about my compassion, competence, and unwavering dedication to their families' well-being. Their testimonials painted a picture of someone incapable of the manipulation my family was alleging. During this time, I also learned more about the sophisticated financial planning my grandparents had undertaken. They had worked with a team of experts to structure the inheritance in ways that would maximize its charitable impact while protecting it from family disputes. The bulk of the assets had been placed in an irrevocable trust with specific guidelines for distribution, ensuring that the money would be used for educational and community purposes rather than personal enrichment. The trust documents revealed the depth of their disappointment with my family's behavior. In detailed notes accompanying the legal paperwork, they had documented years of broken promises, manipulative behavior, and entitled attitudes. They had given my parents, Emma, and Uncle James multiple opportunities to demonstrate genuine family affection rather than financial interest, but had been consistently disappointed. We hoped they would change, Grandpa Harold had written in a letter included with the trust documents. We kept thinking that maybe the next visit would be different, that they would ask about our health instead of our assets, that they would show interest in our work instead of our wealth. But pattern after pattern proved that their primary concern was always what they could get from us rather than what they could give to us or to the community we care about. 6 months after my grandparents' death, the court officially validated their will and dismissed all challenges. My family's legal fees had mounted into the hundreds of thousands, money they didn't have and couldn't recover. Emma's law firm was embarrassed by the public failure of her case, and her reputation in the legal community suffered. Uncle James returned to California, his startup dreams derailed by legal expenses and negative publicity. My parents faced bankruptcy, their house finally going into foreclosure. But I took no joy in their defeats. I had lost my family, not through death, but through greed and betrayal. The people who should have been celebrating my grandparents' lives with me had instead tried to destroy me for honoring their wishes. I threw myself into building the foundation, working with community leaders to identify the greatest needs and develop programs that would have made Harold and Eleanor proud. We established 3 new tutoring centers in underserved communities, created a scholarship fund for first-generation college students, and developed a program providing educational support to families facing medical crises. The Mitchell Educational Services Company, now under my ownership, became a model for ethical business practices. I increased employee benefits, established profit-sharing programs, and reinvested earnings into community development rather than personal enrichment. The company's mission shifted from simple profit generation to genuine community impact, just as my grandparents would have wanted. My personal life remained simple. I continued working as a pediatric nurse, using my regular salary for living expenses and dedicating the inheritance entirely to the foundation and community programs. I moved into my grandparents' house, not because it was larger or more luxurious than my apartment, but because it felt like home in a way no other place ever had. Emma made one final attempt at reconciliation, showing up at my door 2 years after the inheritance battle ended. She looked different, thinner, older, wearing clothes that had seen better days. Her legal career had stalled after the public failure of her case, and she was struggling to rebuild her reputation. "Sophia," she said, standing on the porch where we had once played as children, "I need to talk to you." I invited her in, offering coffee and trying to suppress the complicated emotions her presence stirred up. We sat in the living room where so many family meetings had taken place, where our grandparents had once tried to teach us the difference between having money and being wealthy. "I was wrong," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just about the inheritance, but about everything. About what mattered, about what Grandpa and Grandma were trying to teach us." She told me about losing her job, about the mounting debt from legal fees, about finally understanding the difference between earning money and deserving money. She talked about remembering conversations with our grandparents that she had dismissed as outdated moralizing, now recognizing them as wisdom she had been too proud to accept. "I don't want money," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I just want my sister back." It was the most honest conversation we had ever had, and it opened the door to a cautious reconciliation. Emma began volunteering with the foundation, using her legal skills to help families navigate educational bureaucracy and financial aid applications. She moved back to Vermont, taking a job with a nonprofit organization that provided legal services to low-income families. Our relationship was different now, scarred by betrayal but slowly healing through shared work and mutual respect. She never asked for money, never suggested that the inheritance should be shared, never returned to the entitled behavior that had driven us apart. Instead, she found ways to contribute to the legacy our grandparents had left behind. My parents and Uncle James never reached out. According to mutual friends, they had relocated to different states, still bitter about the inheritance and convinced that they had been wronged. Sometimes I felt sad about the permanent rift in our family, but I had learned that love cannot be one-sided and that respect cannot be demanded. 5 years after my grandparents' death, the Harold and Eleanor Mitchell Foundation had become one of Vermont's most respected charitable organizations. We had provided scholarships to over 200 students, funded educational programs in dozens of schools, and helped countless families navigate medical and financial crises. The tutoring centers had expanded to serve 3 states, and our success model was being studied by educational nonprofits across the country. I stood in the cemetery on a crisp autumn morning, visiting my grandparents' graves as I did every month. The granite headstone was simple, engraved only with their names, dates, and the words they taught others to learn. "I think you'd be proud," I said softly, placing fresh flowers beside the headstone. "The foundation is thriving." Emma found her way back, and I finally understand what you meant about money being a tool, not a goal. The Vermont mountains stretched out beyond the cemetery, their peaks touched with early snow. I thought about the scared 7-year-old who had walked through a blizzard to find love and acceptance in a small house on Maple Street. That little girl had grown up to become the guardian of a legacy much larger than money, a legacy of service, compassion, and the belief that every person has value and potential. As I drove home to the house that would always be theirs as much as mine, I felt the presence of Harold and Eleanor Mitchell in every decision I made, every life I touched, every moment I chose service over selfishness. They had given me more than an inheritance. They had given me a purpose, a family of choice, and the understanding that true wealth comes not from what you accumulate, but from what you give away. 10 years had passed since that life-changing phone call, and the foundation had grown beyond anything I could have imagined. We had established educational centers in 12 states, provided scholarships to over 1,500 students, and created innovative programs that were being replicated across the country. The Mitchell model, as educators began calling it, combined academic tutoring with emotional support, family counseling, and community engagement. I had also learned to navigate the complex world of nonprofit management while maintaining my nursing practice. 3 days a week, I still worked in the pediatric ward at Vermont Children's Hospital, finding that direct patient care kept me grounded and reminded me why the foundation's work mattered. The other 4 days were devoted to foundation activities, reviewing grant applications, visiting program sites, meeting with potential donors, and working with our growing staff of dedicated professionals. The foundation's headquarters remained in my grandparents' house, though we had expanded into the adjacent properties as our operations grew. I had been careful to preserve the original structure's warmth and character while adding the functionality needed for a modern nonprofit organization. Grandpa Harold's study had become the archives, housing thousands of letters from scholarship recipients, photos from program graduations, and documentation of lives changed through educational opportunity. One of our most successful initiatives was the Family Learning Centers, inspired by my own experience of finding sanctuary and support in my grandparents' home. These centers provided not just academic assistance but also family counseling, parenting classes, and community support networks. We had learned that educational success couldn't be separated from family stability and community connection. I often thought about how my own family might have benefited from such programs. Perhaps if my parents had learned to value relationships over acquisitions, if Emma had understood that success meant more than personal advancement, if Uncle James had discovered the satisfaction of contributing rather than consuming, our family story might have ended differently. But I had also learned that you cannot save people who don't want to be saved. My parents had chosen their path of resentment and blame. Uncle James continued to pursue get-rich-quick schemes from his California base, occasionally surfacing in news stories about failed ventures and SEC investigations. They had been given opportunities for redemption, for engagement with meaningful work, for connection to something larger than their own desires, but had rejected every overture. Emma's transformation had been the bright spot in an otherwise painful family dissolution. She had not only rebuilt her legal career, but had become one of Vermont's most respected advocates for low-income families. She specialized in educational law, helping families navigate special education services, fighting discriminatory practices, and ensuring that every child had access to appropriate learning opportunities. Our relationship had evolved from sisters to partners in service. Emma brought legal expertise to the Foundation's advocacy work, while I provided the healthcare and community development perspective. We had learned to laugh together again, to support each other through difficulties, and to honor our grandparents' memory through our collaboration. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if the inheritance had been split equally? Emma asked during one of our monthly dinners at the old house. I considered the question carefully. I think it would have been gone within 5 years, I replied. Dad and Mom would have used their share to maintain their lifestyle without addressing the underlying problems. Uncle James would have invested it in some risky scheme and lost it all. And you? I would have bought a bigger apartment and a better car and convinced myself I deserved it all, Emma finished honestly. I wouldn't have learned what I needed to learn about service and sacrifice and what really matters in life. She was right. The inheritance battle, painful as it had been, had forced all of us to confront our true values and priorities. Only Emma had been willing to change, to grow, to become worthy of the legacy our grandparents had tried to leave for all of us. The Foundation had also become a catalyst for broader social change. Our research on educational inequality had influenced state policy decisions. Our innovative programs had been studied by researchers at major universities. Our model of combining academic support with family services had been adopted by organizations across the country. But perhaps most importantly, we had created a sustainable system for identifying and nurturing young people who shared Harold and Eleanor Mitchell's values. Many of our scholarship recipients had gone on to careers in education, healthcare, social work, and public service. They were becoming teachers who inspired struggling students, nurses who provided compassionate care to vulnerable populations, social workers who advocated for families in crisis, and community leaders who prioritized service over self-interest. I had established a special program called the Mitchell Fellows, which provided full college scholarships plus mentorship opportunities for students who demonstrated both academic potential and commitment to community service. These young people spent summers working with the Foundation, learning about nonprofit management, community development, and social entrepreneurship. Many of them had already launched their own service projects in their home communities. Maria Santos, one of our first Mitchell Fellows, had returned to her hometown in rural New Hampshire after graduating from college and started a mobile tutoring program serving isolated farming communities. David Kim, another fellow, had developed an innovative app that connected struggling students with volunteer tutors and had parlayed that success into a social enterprise company focused on educational technology for underserved populations. These young leaders carried forward the values my grandparents had tried to instill in our family, proving that legacy isn't just about blood relations, but about shared commitment to making the world better. They were the true heirs to Harold and Eleanor Mitchell's vision, and watching them succeed gave me more satisfaction than any material possession ever could. My personal life had also found balance and meaning in unexpected ways. I had met Dr. Michael Torres, a pediatric cardiologist, during a particularly difficult case involving a young patient with a complex heart condition. Our professional collaboration had gradually developed into friendship and eventually into love. Michael shared my commitment to serving vulnerable populations and had his own history of choosing meaning over money. He had turned down lucrative positions in private practice to work at the Children's Hospital, where he could treat patients regardless of their family's ability to pay. We had married in a small ceremony at the local Methodist church where my grandparents' funeral had been held, surrounded by foundation staff, nursing colleagues, former patients' families, and the extended community that had become our chosen family. Emma had been my maid of honor, and Mrs. Stone, now in her 70s but still sharp and devoted, had read a passage from my grandparents' letters about the importance of finding a partner who shared your values. Michael and I had decided not to have biological children, but instead to focus our parenting energy on the hundreds of young people whose lives we touched through our work. We were official foster parents to 3 teenagers who had aged out of the traditional system, and unofficial mentors to dozens of foundation scholarship recipients who needed guidance navigating college and career decisions. Our home, the house where I had found safety and love as a confused 7-year-old, had once again become a gathering place for people seeking support and encouragement. We hosted regular dinners for foundation staff, informal counseling sessions for struggling families, and celebration parties for scholarship recipients' achievements. As I reflected on the journey from that devastating phone call 10 years ago to the rich, meaningful life I now lived, I understood that my grandparents' greatest gift hadn't been the money. It had been the preparation. They had spent years teaching me through example what it meant to live with purpose, to value relationships over acquisitions, to find joy in service to others. The inheritance had simply provided the tools to live out those lessons on a larger scale. Without their modeling of generosity, integrity, and community commitment, I might have been as overwhelmed and corrupted by sudden wealth as my family members had predicted. But because they had invested years in shaping my character, I had been ready to accept the responsibility that came with resources. Standing in the garden where Grandma Eleanor had taught me to tend roses, looking up at the Vermont mountains that had watched over generations of our family, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from living in alignment with your deepest values. The money would eventually be spent, the foundation would outlive me and pass into other hands, but the lessons I had learned about love, service, and the true meaning of wealth would continue to bear fruit in countless lives for generations to come. The inheritance battle was over, but the real work, the work they had prepared me for my entire life, continued every day. And I was grateful for every moment of it, every challenge overcome, every life touched, every small step toward the more just and compassionate world they had dreamed of creating.